Hey, I'm Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co. And today with me we have Sharon and Matt from Steamforge Games. We're going to be talking about Elden Ring, the board game. I walk into some interviews with lists of questions. I don't have a list of questions. I just played Elden Ring, the board game, though. You can check that out. There'll be a playthrough over on my channel of the boss fight, as well as over on the Brothers Murph. We're going to have the encounter phase. So I'll link to both of those down below. You can check those out. But this is primarily going to be based around that as far as I'm concerned. I just went through it, had a blast, and have a lot of questions about different aspects of the game. But before we dive into that, just starting off with Elden Ring in general, just what has it been like to work on this, and how long have you been working on this?
So we've been talking to Bandai Namco for many years now. We found out about this game, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
We were obviously sworn to secrecy, and the amount of information available at that time was a little bit limited, but we stayed in touch and have been kept in the loop periodically. But we started in earnest probably about 2.5, 3 years ago, and started to really build out what the game loop could be and how we wanted it to feel and experience. But obviously, there was a requirement for secrecy all the way through, but we had to wait for the full game to come through to really understand what the full experience was.
Well, so asking me that question, which is how much design was happening before you even had a chance to play the game?
A fair bit, and you are operating a little bit on assumptions. We knew a lot about the game, but I think until you've actually played and experienced a game, it's very hard to understand the emotional response that you're looking for, how you feel about the game, what kind of activities catch your attention, where you spend most of your time, what feels important and what feels less important. So we had a really good sense of what it was. But I think you have to make it very personal, and to do that, you have to play the game yourself.
Now, it's an interesting way the game is broken up. The game's going to be broken up into this encounter phase. Is it called encounter phase? Exploration phase. The exploration phase and then the boss encounters. Now, the interesting thing about this is both Elden Rings and Dark Souls theoretically have that concept to them, exploring and boss fights and all these aspects. But you took a very different design approach to this one. You have it broken up into an exploration phase and then a boss combat on a grid, as opposed to in Dark Souls, you focus more on just encounter. What led to that difference in decision of having like a two-part game?
Do you want to talk to that one?
Yeah, I can do that. So I think the key thing to understand about it's exactly what you were saying about the emotive response to what the game is, and also the experience of playing the game. Dark Souls is a game which is very much based on encounter. Whenever you go into any new area, you fight combat against a variety of different enemies, and you're constantly thinking, where you're a threat, where the threat is coming from. And when you move to the next one, you'll really move to another arena, another combat puzzle. Elden Ring, over half that game you spend exploring. You spend riding around, looking off to the horizon, trying to see what's new, what new exciting thing is there, whether there's some ruins, whatever else. Even the enemies, for example, you walk straight out and soon the first thing you see is obviously the tree sentinel. You can circumnavigate that. You can go around it if you want to. And that very much influences our ideas about how you want to resolve the combat. How do we represent that experience? One of the best things I think about Elden Ring is this idea of just how elegantly the game goes from this huge, wide exploration of the landscape and everything else, and then as soon as you find an enemy that you're fighting, the whole thing zooms really deep in, and now suddenly we're fighting one-on-one against this enemy. Nothing has changed with the map. What you are seeing is this idea where nothing else seems to matter around that immediacy of combat.
Focus, isn't it?
So it's all about the immediacy of the combat that you're actually fighting, and that intimacy is what we've really tried to bring out in the combat system we have, which is obviously a very different emotive response to what you have in Dark Souls.
So over on the gameplay we just had, we dove into an exploration and then the boss fight. But as far as the full experience, you mentioned that there were 15, what do they call them? What's the
main quest?
15 main quests. And so our main quest was an exploration followed by a boss fight. Is that the first one that they'd encounter in the game?
That's the probably close to, not exactly the first one, but that's pretty your sort of fairly entry-level kind of starter quest.
And you mentioned as well during our playthrough, at the end of our playthrough, that not all explorations end in a boss fight. How do explorations end then at some point? If they don't have a boss fight, is there a combat of any kind? What happens there?
Yeah, well, there's a variety of different quests. I won't do too many spoilers in this, but we want to obviously mix things up and really to recreate the experience. Sometimes you are just exploring the landscape, trying to find new areas. Sometimes you might have a narrative quest where it's primarily in the quest book, and actually there can be some combat as part of that or an exploration component, but the primary focus you're having is going through that. And obviously sometimes you will just literally have a gauntlet where I'm going through encounter. Elden Ring is a very rich and diverse experience. We want to represent that with what we're doing with our main quest as well.
So speaking of quest book and narrative and all that, so what we experienced when going through the game was a degree of, you have this small little text of what's happening, you have the occasional flipping of a new card, a new instance, a new something, then you encounter the boss fight, you get a small little section. Is that the level of narrative in the game, or is there more narrative to it?
Do you want to go?
Yeah, sure, if you want me to. So I think, much like the main video game, the way the narrative is explored is in small parcels. So I don't think that we will see huge, lengthy pieces of text. So I think it's more a case of piecing together the snippets of information and sewing your own narrative and building your own understanding of the world. And I think that's one of the things that's quite exciting about our interpretation, if you like, is the NPCs that you meet will reveal more about the world. They will create opportunities for new narratives to emerge, and that will be unique for your table, because the timing of when that happens, when you satisfy the conditions and moves on to the next part of the story, those will all happen as a result of how you're playing the game, what quest lines you choose to go on, and in what order you choose to do them.
Gotcha. Now, as far as variability, one thing I'm very intrigued by, having gone through that experience, is how things change as you continue to play. As you play boss fight, as you play monsters, as you play different exploration phase or quests. So, like, even just from a stance of the tiles and the journey, are we operating with the same tiles for each quest?
So the tiles and a number of the other decks are actually if they evolve through the course of the game. So you will get a sense of progression through the tiles that you're using. You'll get a sense of seeing familiar places, but then you'll start seeing new places as tiles are swapped in and out as you're moving through the various quest lines.
Interesting. So you're using a center stack and you're evolving, taking out and adding in tiles.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of reasons that are important for us to do that. One is it gives us as players a sense that we're affecting the world and we can see our version of the world unfolding. And then there's also a basic mechanical benefit that it makes it very easy for us to shorten the setup time. If you're literally just grabbing a stack of tiles, and at the end of that scenario you'll take 2 out and put 2 new into it, you know that what's in that stack of tiles, but it means the next time you come out to play, you just grab a stack of tiles, you're good to go. So it means that the setup is vastly reduced.
Perfect. Now, similarly, from a sense of variability and the monster fights and whatnot, all the various, whether boss or whether regular encounters, whether regular fights, you had mentioned that there's an element of terrain that we didn't really get to see in the experience. But how, if you have like a single boss fight, a single exploration plus boss fight can have as many as, 7 or 8 different encounter grids being set up between those. I'm curious how that evolves. Like, how do you keep that? Are there plans to keep that encounter grid consistently different, or the books changing, or all these? Like, how different will things get as far as that puzzle? Because I'll say, I mean, you'll see this in other conversations, but I really enjoyed our play. But I am curious, how much does that change or evolve as you're encountering new things versus how much is the puzzle fairly similar as things go?
Do you want to tackle that one?
So the actual maps, we'll start with the grids. So the battle stance system carries on throughout. You're always going to have aggressive, neutral, or defensive stances. But the bonuses you get for those particular stances will change depending on what the map is. So you could have some which is mostly marshland, and actually you don't necessarily have the attack benefit in that one, for sake of argument. But the actual, there's more of a mire where it costs you additional points to move around the middle area or the neutral zone. And these are different ideas that we can really use to influence one thing. The other element is obviously adding enemy bonuses to this as well. So instead of looking at it very much from the axis of how do I get a benefit from being in stances, now the focus is very much on how do I manipulate enemy positioning to really get them to have disadvantage or advantages and so on. So that's another element. Terrain bolts into another component of that. So it's something where we can put in low walls. So if you're behind that spatially, then you're getting obviously defense bonuses and so on. Or we can have areas where you simply can't cross over into. There can be items we can use to affect that. There could be a firebomb that comes down and creates a barrier for a temporary period of time and so on. The best thing about having the quest books is that obviously it gives us a real easy way of having a dynamic change to an encounter. You can literally turn a page and suddenly it's a whole new encounter going on. And that could be a boss heat up, that could be something that happens during a regular encounter. There's other things we can do as well, things like ambushes where you're pushing another book to add in and suddenly you've got an extra battlefield that's attached to it or whatever else. You've expanded the battlefield grid. There's an awful lot of variability that we can use in this.
Perfect. Because I agree completely about the aspect of the quest books, which is why I was curious to see how they'd evolve. I loved what we saw, but we saw some variability as we dove into the boss fights, and we saw enemy variability for sure, but I definitely want to see more, especially as you're diving into more and more, and I know you have a whole product line plan and more core boxes and all those things. So I'd love to see that evolve. Speaking of evolving, as far as character depth, character development, I should say, obviously we already saw a small degree of being able to find gear or items or things like that. But how do characters develop? Are you able to affect their decks, their combat decks, their effect decks? How do things change there?
So when you happy for me to? Yeah, shoot. So there's a couple of different axes you can look at with this. So starting with the action deck. So that's very much determined by your equipment. So obviously you all have starting equipment and you've just seen some of what that is. That will determine what cards go into that. So if you want to dual wield and take 2 swords, then you absolutely can. Of course, not going to do much for your defensive cards in that deck. And as you've learned, that's probably not a good
Defense didn't seem like a big deal.
No, obviously not.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. So you can absolutely bolt that stuff in if you want to, and play that way. You can even play a 2-handed weapon if you want, and very much reduce your action deck. But obviously, that again will give you no defensive bonuses. Will give you attack bonuses, which is good, but and so on. Now, if you find new weapons, new shields, new weapons, whatever else, yeah, you can replace your existing gear, and that will change out what's in your attack deck. You can also upgrade your weapons with smithing stones. So at that point, you can really bolt those bits.
Oh, the elusive smithing stones.
The elusive smithing stones. So at that point, you then upgrade the cards that are in that deck. So that light attack becomes light attack plus for the sake of argument, and then suddenly now you've got a more powerful version of what that is. So that's the first capacity. That's the first angle you can do. The second part is when you're actually looking at your characteristics. Now, there's 2 principal ways that affects. The first one I'll do, and I'll pass over to you for the second one. Okay. But so the first one is your primary stats, and that's the effect deck. So that's going to be your strength, your dex, your faith, and your intelligence. And those ones are really manipulating the cards in that effect deck. Now, that effect deck, you can go wide, and you can look at it and go, well, I'm going to get rid of some of those generic effects and replace them with 2 generic symbols or whatever else, and go for a more even balanced spread. Or alternatively, you can specialize. So actually, I'm going to go as many strength focus cards as I can, because if I'm using a strength build character, if I have a strength weapon, then that will key off more of those effects, and it becomes more like I've got big swings, more reliable to get those particular types of effects I'm looking for. That's really open to you as a player to determine how you want to build. And I think a key part of that is obviously going to be influenced by your weapons. Scalability is a big deal in Elden Ring, and it's something where if I find a new piece of equipment, if I'm using a longsword and then actually I switch over and now I'm using a katana of some description and that's a dex-based weapon, well, maybe I'm now going to start leveling up into having dex cards in my hand instead. So then that way I've got a real sort of flexibility to work in different types of decks.
You mentioned the second part.
I'll pass over.
Oh, thank you very much. So the second part is the other attributes that you can upgrade in the video game, but this is a slightly different abstraction. And what we're looking to do is give players the ability to personalize their character, and also to give them build paths that allow them to feel like they're constantly developing their character beyond that point. So we have a concept of trait slots. Each character will have a number of trait slots. You can spend runes to gain additional trait slots. And into those trait slots, you can put traits.
Text-based abilities?
Yes.
Like, what's an example of a trait?
An example of a trait might be +1 hand size.
Okay.
It might be +1 health. It might be draw a card at the end of your turn.
Okay.
So those will be linked to the other 4 attributes. So vitality, endurance, will, etc. And they will also have the ability for us to affect not necessarily the stuff that happens in the combat, but also on the exploration phase. So if you increase your mind, I think, for example, which one? Arcane, thank you. That will increase your draw. So when you get a loot drop, you might draw 2 and pick 1, whereas previously you just draw 1. So they're little buffs, if you like, or they're little accesses to extra bits of functionality that help distinguish your Tarnish from your fellow players. And because of the nature of them, as you progress through the game, it's able to get access to more and more. So there'll be probably a degree of a tech tree on these traits as you're going down.
Interesting, because one of the things I was going to ask about is I really enjoyed the characters. Each of the characters in the game come with their own ability, and then you also have the armor gives you an ability, and so between them you have both stats and a deck and attack deck and all those things. But I like abilities. I like the coolness that something interesting can happen with, and so I'm curious to see how that evolves with the character as you grow. Like how many more abilities or ways to really feel strongly distinguished past pure stats happen.
It gives you the opportunity. So I don't know which character you played in
Samurai.
your playthrough. Right, okay.
I love moving diagonally.
Yeah,
So much fun.
The moving diagonally is absolutely key to his character. But take, for example, the astrologer, that if you fully defend an attack, then you generate some focus. So you're now looking for opportunities to kind of trigger that to get the benefit of that trait. So these trait slots give you the ability to slot more of those opportunities in. So if you're a combo-based player, you can put these things in that just give you opportunities to do really cool little snacky things. If you're more simplistically like I am, extra health, extra hand size, I'm just going to have more options. And I don't necessarily need to think about it. I can focus on what I'm doing on the tabletop. So it really allows you to tailor the character to play how you want to play it.
Excellent. Now, going straight off a question about how do we power up our characters, what's being done as far as balance in order to ensure that 15 quests deep, and I know even more than that because of this, the idea that you can play a tarnished across multiple core boxes, what's the balance approach to making sure if things are too hard, you're able to bring back up to speed, if things are too easy, you're able to modulate around that?
So the quest will be, the main quest will be presented in clusters. Mm-hmm. So you will have a number of quests available to you at any given time. It won't necessarily always reveal what the relative strengths of them are, but they're not all going to be equal. So you will go off exploring the lands between, and you will discover that, yeah, maybe something is a bit tough, but much like the video game, it doesn't rubber band or change that experience. It actively encourages to go and explore elsewhere. You're not ready for this place yet. You're not, this isn't somewhere where you should be. But it never actually closes you off, because if you have the right skill set, if you have the right approach, and if you're fortunate enough, you can actually tackle just about anything in the game with what's that guy who runs around with no clothes on us? Yeah, exactly. So it's entirely possible to go all the way through the game if you're good enough at it.
So as far as our boss fight, for example, so we did win our boss fight, slight spoiler there. Had we lost it, the whole exploration phase starts from the beginning?
Yeah, pretty much. There's a fail state. There has to be a fail state in order for there to be real danger.
Gotcha.
Yeah, we're pretty hardline on that.
It's Elden Ring.
It's Elden Ring. No, I don't mind. Just trying to figure out the balance around the arc of the game and how that proceeds. Go ahead.
I was going to say something worth considering is that when we add expansions, when we add extra content, and this obviously is not strictly true for the core, when we're looking at the core boxes, you will be progression throughout all of them, but when you are looking at some quests, there doesn't necessarily always need to be this relentless drive towards leveling up and improving stats. Sometimes that can be a lore reward or an equipment reward or something else. We don't always have to be so linear with how we progress these things. There's lots of different axes we can, again, drill into to make sure that you feel like there's progression happening with what you're doing.
Gotcha. How many characters are there in the core game?
Tarnished.
Tarnished.
So your core box will have 4, but I'm pretty sure I know that we'll be seeing some in some of the other unlocks. I know Weeping Peninsula has an additional 2 that are not shared with this. And I know Stormvale Castle have another 2 that's there. And I'm pretty sure there's at least 8. We might see 2 more. We might see some more. Depends on how the exploration goes.
And for bosses?
How many bosses?
Yeah.
Weirdly, this is a slightly cliche answer. I don't know I can count that. There's a lot.
There's a lot of bosses.
There's a lot of big models in this game.
Well, there's 15 main quests, and then there's a whole bunch of mini quests, and some of those mini quests also involve interacting with the bosses.
Is there ever a degree of re-encountering bosses you defeated?
So we have some fun ideas. I think it's safe to say that, and I'm not going to spoil anything just yet by saying it because that seems a bit too much of a spoiler, but you won't be seeing models like this one, for example, just the once as in your end boss. There are other ways to encounter them. There are other ways that we get some use out of these models and you actually get to refight them again. Now, whether that's exactly the same or whether you're fighting a slightly different version of someone like Godric the Grafted, and there's a spoiler there for someone, Godfrey, then you can go from there.
Excellent. I think that's all I have as far as questions go. As far as anything else we should know?
Did you enjoy your game?
I very much enjoyed the game.
That's all I need to know.
You can watch the playthrough. I very much enjoyed the game.
That's good.
Excellent. So thanks so much, Sharon, Matt. I appreciate it. I mean, we'll have more stuff about this. Like I said, there's already a playthrough. There's multiple playthroughs. There's gonna be a ton of content coming from Steamforged Games in general. You're having a whole event around here. You can check out a lot. We'll have a link to the Kickstarter down below as well. But in any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game & Co. Sharon, Matt, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you have a good one.